Hello everyone, welcome to the 140 Literary and Jury Charge. We're going to do a conclusion with the additional information about Martin Luther King Jr. Okay, here we go. Ready? Early life and education. Martin Luther King Jr. was born on January 15, 1929 in Atlanta, Georgia, to Reverend Martin Luther King Sr. and Alberta Williams King. His legal name at birth was Michael King. King's father was also born Michael King. The father changed both names on his own during a 1934 trip to Nazi Germany to attend the Fifth Baptist World Alliance Congress in Berlin. It was during this time he chose to be called Martin Luther King in honor of the great German reformer Martin Luther. Growing up in Atlanta, King attended Booker T. Washington High School. A precocious student, he skipped both the 9th and the 12th grades and entered Morehouse College at age 15 without formally graduating from high school. In 1948, he graduated from Morehouse with a BA degree in sociology and enrolled in Crozer Theological Seminary in Chester, Pennsylvania, from which he graduated with a degree in 1951. King married Coretta Scott on June 18, 1953, on the lawn of her parents' house in her hometown of Heiberger, Alabama. They became the parents of 4 children: Yolanda King, Martin Luther King III, Dexter Scott King, and Bernice King. King became pastor of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama, when he was 25 years old. King then began he began his doctoral studies in systematic theology at the Boston University and received his PhD degree on June 5, 1955, with a dissertation on a comparison of the conceptions of God in the thinking of Paul Tillich and Henry Nelson Wyman. Ideas, influences, and political stances. Religion. As a Christian minister, Martin Luther King's main influence was Jesus Christ and the Christian Gospels, which he would almost always quote in his religious meetings, speeches at church, and in public discourses. King's faith was strongly based in Jesus' commandment of loving your neighbor as yourself, loving God above all, and loving your enemies, praying for them and blessing them. His nonviolent thought was also based in the injunction to turn the other cheek in the Sermon on the Mount and Jesus' teaching of putting the sword back into its place. In his famous letter from Birmingham jail, King urged action consistent with what he describes as Jesus' extremist love, and also quoted numerous other Christian pacifist authors, which was very unusual for him. In his speech, "I've Been to the Mountaintop," he stated that he just wanted to do God's will. Inspired by Gandhi's success with nonviolent activism, King had for a long time wanted to take a trip to India. With the assistance from the Quaker group, the American Friends Service Committee, he was able to make the trip in April 1959. The trip to India affected King, deepening his understanding of nonviolent resistance and his commitment to America's struggle for civil rights. In a radio address made during his final evening in India, King reflected, "Since being in India, I am more convinced than ever before that the method of nonviolent resistance is the most potent weapon available to oppressed people in their struggle for justice and human dignity." Politics. As a leader of the SCLC, King maintained a policy of not publicly endorsing a U.S. political party or candidate. "I feel someone must remain in the position of non-alignment so that he can look objectively at both parties and be the conscience of both, not the servant or master of either." In his autobiography, King says that in 1960, he privately voted for Democratic candidate John F. Kennedy. "I felt that Kennedy would make the best president. I never came out with an endorsement. My father did, but I never made one." King adds that he likely would have made an exception to his non-endorsement policy for a second Kennedy term, saying, "Had President Kennedy lived, I would probably have endorsed him again in 1964. Montgomery Bus Boycott 1955. In March 1955, a 15-year-old schoolgirl in Montgomery, Claudette Colvin, refused to give up her bus seat to a white man in compliance with Jim Crow laws in the U.S. South that enforced racial segregation. King was on the committee from the Birmingham African American community that looked into the case because Colvin was pregnant and unmarried. E.D. Nixon and Clifford Durr decided to wait for a better case to pursue. On December 1, 1955, Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to give up her seat. The Montgomery Bus Boycott, urged and planned by Nixon and led by King, soon followed. The boycott lasted 385 days, and the situation became so tense that King's house was bombed. King was arrested during this campaign, which concluded with a United States District Court ruling in Browder versus Gale that ended racial segregation on all Montgomery public buses. King's role in the bus boycott transformed him into a national figure and the best-known spokesman of the civil rights movement. Southern Christian Leadership Conference. In 1957, King, Ralph Abernathy, Fred Shuttlesworth, Joseph Lowry, and other civil rights activists found the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, known as SCLC. The group was created to harness the moral authority and organizing power of black churches to conduct nonviolent protests in the service of civil rights reform. King led the SCLC until his death. King believed that organized, nonviolent protest against the system of Southern segregation, known as Jim Crow laws, would lead to extensive media coverage of the struggle for black equality and voting rights. Journalistic accounts and televised footage of the daily deprivation and indignities suffered by Southern blacks and of segregation violence and harassment of civil rights workers and marchers produced a wave of sympathetic public opinion that convinced the majority of Americans that the civil rights movement was the most important issue in American politics in the early 1960s. King organized and led marches for blacks' right to vote, desegregation, labor rights, and other basic civil rights. Most of these rights were successfully enacted into the law of the United States with the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And there's more, but we're going to stop there. Moving right into some jury charge. All right, here we go. Ready? Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we will adjourn now for lunch. You will be taken to lunch. You should be back here by 2:30. Please do not discuss the case among yourselves. Do not discuss it with anyone else. Do not have anyone discuss it with you. We want you to decide this case on the evidence that you are going to hear in this courtroom. We want you to keep your minds open until you have heard all of the evidence. You are not to visit any of the places mentioned in the evidence. The physical conditions at those places today may be different from what they were in July of 2012. If there is anything on the radio or on television or in the newspaper about this case, you are to ignore it. After all, you will know more about this case than any newspaper or television reporter. You will hear the legal evidence. This is a serious case. You are to strictly obey these admonitions. We will adjourn now until 2:30. All right, I'm going to read an excerpt from Don't Sweat the Small Stuff. This is on set aside quiet time every day. Ready? Here we go. As I begin to write this strategy, it's exactly 4:30 in the morning, my favorite time of the day. I still have at least an hour and a half before my wife and children get out of bed and the phone begins to ring. At least an hour before anyone can ask me to do anything. It's absolutely silent outside, and I'm in complete solitude. There is something rejuvenating and peaceful about being alone and having some time to reflect, work, or simply enjoy the quiet. I've been working in the stress management field for well over a decade. In that time, I've met some extraordinary people. I can't think of a single person whom I would consider to be inwardly peaceful who doesn't carve out at least a quiet time virtually every day, whether it's 10 minutes of meditation or yoga, spending a little time in nature, or locking the bathroom door and taking a 10-minute bath. Quiet time to yourself is a vital part of life. Like spending time alone, it helps to balance the noise and confusion that infiltrate much of our day. Personally, when I set aside quiet time for myself, it makes the rest of my day seem manageable. When I don't, I really notice the difference. There's a little ritual that I do that I've shared with many friends. Like many people, I drive to and from my office on a daily basis. On my way home from work, as I get close to my driveway, I pull my car over and stop. There is a nice spot where I can spend a minute or two looking at the view or closing my eyes and breathing. It slows me down and helps me feel centered and grateful. I've shared this strategy with dozens of people who used to complain about having no time for quiet. They would speed into their driveways with the radio blaring in their ears. Now, with a simple shift in their actions, they enter their homes feeling much more relaxed. All right. I have some straight matter, and the subject is sexual battery. Okay. All right, here we go. The federal code covers exclusion of jurors on the basis of race or color. Actually, this one doesn't refer to sexual battering. I'm sorry. The next section does, okay? Which we're going to go into because this is only about a paragraph long, okay? The federal code also covers exclusion of jurors on the basis of race or color, discrimination against a person wearing the uniform of the armed forces, protection of a wide range of activities from election rights to public school enrollment to interstate businesses during a riot, deprivation of relief benefits, damage to religious property, or obstruction of the free exercise of religious beliefs, and obstruction of access to reproductive health services. Penalties are primarily fines, but also include up to life imprisonment and sentence of death for serious violations and inclusion of kidnapping, sexual abuse, or killing in the crime. Now moving into the sexual battery. Okay. Reform. Rape, a type of aggravated battery, is so universally abhorrent that it has held its place as a separate and more serious crime. Unlawful sexual intercourse against the victim's will by force or threat of immediate force could be punished by death until Coker versus Georgia declared the death penalty for rape unconstitutional. The intimate nature that makes this offense so serious makes it difficult to discuss and evaluate. Rigid perceptions of gender roles also have hindered a willingness to be more open in discussing sex crimes. Recently, however, reforms in social attitudes have reached the law, expanding protection against a greater variety of offenses and placing greater emphasis on harm to the victim. New statutes increasingly reflect the following changes: victims' testimony. Sexual offense trials often pit the word of the victim against the word of the defendant. Traditionally, the victim's credibility had to be bolstered by evidence of her previous chastity and corroboration of witnesses. Her believability dwindled further with any delay in reporting the crime. Now, rape shield laws prevent evidence of the victim's prior sexual activity from being introduced in court unless it is relevant to consent. Children can testify in some courts via videotape or with the aid of anatomically correct dolls to make the experience less traumatic. Statutes of limitations restricting the time period in which prosecution must be started have been eliminated for sexual offenses against children in 11 states and eliminated without regard to age for the most serious sexual offenses in an additional 6 states. Many other states have extended time limits. Corroboration may be circumstantial. These changes are not without problems. A defendant's Sixth Amendment right to confront the accuser may be diminished by videotaped testimony. Expert opinion that rape trauma syndrome may cause the victim to repress the experience, making difficult the identification of the offender, and reporting of the crime is not admissible in some courts as a still questionable and prejudicial theory. Such changes may interfere with the defendant's right to a speedy trial, as well as with the timely gathering of evidence. Actually, you know what, you guys, there's one more paragraph that I'm going to read before we end, because it goes on to a whole different section of mens rea. Okay, so definitions. The old requirement of utmost resistance from the victim has given way to reasonable resistance, taking into account the risk of death or serious injury against overwhelming force or threat, as well as psychological factors. State versus Studham, Utah, 1997. The expectation that all sex or sexual offense victims are female and all offenders male is beginning to change because of the reality of homosexual rape and the involvement of women as accomplices in rape and aggressors in sexual contact cases. New gender-neutral statutes attempt to cover all participants, and definitions have been expanded to include oral, anal, and vaginal penetration, as well as forms of sexual contact. All right, so we'll stop there because it goes into the next part of this with the statutory rape and the mens rea consent and force. All right, so that concludes our literary and jury charge for the 140 class. Have a great day.